In my last podcast, I outlined how the initial positive colonisation of Taranaki disintegrated into distrust and ultimately war between the new settlers and local Māori. This was under the watch of all four governors, Hobson, Fitzroy, Grey and Gore-Browne. Following this early fighting, New Zealand was in a mess. The new settlement in Taranaki was in tatters and conflict was still flaring up. Waikato Māori was still involved and were becoming increasingly belligerent, with some wanting to drive all the Pākehā out in order to reclaim their land. The Māori King movement had been established 3 years earlier, and while it was not against British colonisation, it did not bring the promised unity between the various hapus. The Māori King was very much a figurehead, especially after the first king, Potata'ao Te Wherewhere, died in 1861. Against this backdrop, the settlers in Auckland and the surrounding areas were becoming increasingly nervous of an anticipated Māori backlash. After returning from a successful session as governor in the Cape Colony in South Africa, Sir George Grey was sent back to New Zealand in 1861 to sort out the mess. However, he had separated from his wife after returning to the UK from South Africa, and he began taking opium, which developed into a severe addiction. And this continued throughout his second term as governor in New Zealand. Now, taking opium and other drugs were commonly prescribed for sleep disorders and pain management at the time. Some, like laudanum, could be purchased over the counter, and chlorodyne was used as both a drink and a cough lozenge for young children, and both contained opium. So how did taking opium affect Grey's decision-making as governor in New Zealand during his second term? While Grey did have health problems, his overall approach was consistent, both in government and with his response to the challenges posed by Māori in Taranaki and Waikato. I found no significant evidence that Grey's decision-making was significantly affected by his drug taking, which was most likely being used for pain relief. His overall goal for Māori was assimilation, which he believed would raise their living standards and provide them with all the benefits of civilization. However, he was determined to do that from a position of strength. So after taking over from Governor Gore-Browne, he began extending the Great South Road all the way to Mangatawhiri, effectively declaring to Māori, if you want to rebel, then we are prepared for war. However, Waikato Māori interpreted Grey's actions as being already committed to war. The Māori King and his supporters had no intention of attacking Auckland, even though the possibility was raised at some of their hui. Rewi Maniapoto was the most vocal supporter of this, and he was restrained from doing so by the Māori King. In December 1861, Grey introduced a new system of native councils, which divided the colony into native and European districts. Native courts, called runangas, could have jurisdiction in native districts. This was enthusiastically accepted by Northern Māori, but not in the Waikato, where the Māori King was demanding equal status with the governor. Grey could not accept this, even though his earlier friendship with Te Wherewhere and his son Matutaira had provided such a solid foundation during his first term as governor. While most Waikato Māori didn't want war and were willing to compromise, they insisted that their king must have a role in their self-government. Grey was not interested, and he refused to recognise the king. He is recorded as saying at one of the tribal meetings that he, and I quote, never went to bed at night without thinking what he could do to put down the Māori King. I shall not fight against him with the sword, but I shall dig around him until he falls of his own accord." End of quote. This comment generated much unease and anger within the Waikato tribes. After Governor Gore-Browne had finally agreed to investigate the Waitara sale in March 1861, Taranaki Māori seized a 4,000-acre Taranaki block southwest of New Plymouth as security to ensure that the Waitara land would be returned. While this agreement had ended the early fighting, none of the conditions for the truce were implemented. So on 12th of March 1863, Gore-Browne's successor, Sir George Grey, sent British troops to evict Māori from Taranaki. The 5 tribes occupying the land viewed this as an act of war, and on the 4th of May, they ambushed a small British party near Orikora and killed 9 of the 10 soldiers. George Grey then used this as an excuse to request 3 extra regiments from the Colonial Office in London. On the 11th of May 1863, Grey issued a proclamation concerning Waitara. The purchase of the said block of land is abandoned, and all claims to the same on the part of the government is henceforth renounced. But this was too late. While Grey agreed to return the disputed Waitara land, he also sent Lieutenant General Duncan Cameron to complete the eviction of 50 Māori who were still occupying Taranaki, killing around half of them in the pa above the Katikara River. Having established his authority in Taranaki, Grey then focused his attention on destroying the Kingitanga movement in the Waikato. He considered the King movement to be an act of rebellion, and he made all the preparations needed for invading the Waikato. He extended the Great South Road to Mangatawhiri River, purchased armoured steamers, and brought around 8,000 soldiers from the British Imperial Army. Waikato Māori understood what was about to unfold and were desperate to find a peaceful solution. With the Imperial troops on the way, George Grey was already committed. However, he needed an excuse for the invasion, and he claimed that Ngāti Maniapoto were agitating to invade Auckland. And there was some truth in this, as Riri Maniapoto had wanted to travel through Waikato land between March and June to avenge a killing, but he was prevented by the Māori King. In his book, The Waikato War, John Figton describes how the war started. On the 9th of July, 1863, Grey issued the proclamation, quote, "All persons of the native race living in the Manukau district and the Waikato frontier are hereby required immediately to take the oath of allegiance to Her Majesty the Queen, and to give up their arms to an officer appointed by the government for that purpose. Natives who comply with this order will be protected. Natives refusing to do so are hereby warned forthwith to leave the district aforesaid and retire to Waikato beyond Mangatawhiri." The Maori to whom this was addressed had been living and trading harmoniously with the European settlers for 20 years. Many had moved there from the Waikato with Te Wherewhero to help protect the Auckland settlers, but they had even stronger ties with their family in the Waikato, and very few of them stayed. On the 12th of July 1863, Colonel Wyatt and 300 men of the 65th Regiment marched on Tuakau and evicted the Maori living there. Tuakau was the southernmost village within the Auckland region. Quote, "The village was situated on the edge of the river and justly considered one of the prettiest and most flourishing in the lower Waikato. The land was good. Potatoes, kumara and corn grew luxuriantly, and each year filled the storehouses of the natives to overflowing. A watermill close by ground their wheat into flour, and their fruit trees were loaded with apples and peaches." End of quote. The Māori living there were forced to leave. The soldiers plundered their produce and burned their property. The Māori response was to kill 2 settlers in Shepherd's Bush. This was to be the first of many settlers being shot or tomahawked as the fighting progressed. On the same day, General Cameron and his troops crossed the Mangatawhiri River. The invasion of Waikato had begun. General Cameron's professional troops ultimately numbered around 12,000 men, who were well armed with the latest weapons. Together with several thousand colonial troops, they outnumbered and outgunned the approximately 4,000 Waikato and Ngāti Maniapoto defenders. Apart from some initial skirmishes, it wasn't until the 20th of November 1863 that the first real assault began on the fortified pa at Rangariri. As in the Northern War, the Crown troops underestimated the Maori defences, and there were heavy losses, with 37 British soldiers killed and 85 wounded. Maori also lost 48 warriors. However, only 185 defenders surrendered. The rest escaped into the surrounding bush. Friedman writes, and I quote, "With the fall of Rangariri was destroyed the power of the lower Waikato tribes. The flower of their fighting men had fallen at Kohiroa and Rangariri, or were taken prisoners of war, and the remnant that escaped retreated to the upper Waikato, where Riwi and his Ngāti Maniapotos had decided to make a stand against the troops." Northern Waikato Maori were desperate for the fighting to stop. They were told that the precondition for that was for the Māori King's residence at Naruawahia to be abandoned and for the Queen's flag to be hoisted to replace the Māori King's flag. Waikato agreed, and General Cameron marched his troops into the deserted settlement and hoisted the Queen's flag on the 6th of December 1863. John Featon then describes Grey's astonishing indecision when advised to end the war. Quote, "The New Zealand Ministry of the day thought, when General Cameron took possession of Naruawahia, that the time had arrived for peace to be made with the natives. It was therefore arranged that the Governor, Sir George Grey, should proceed to Naruawahia and interview those chiefs who were inclined to submit to the Queen's authority. On the appointed day, a carriage and horses were ready to convey His Excellency on his journey. But the Governor changed his mind and decided not to go." End of quote. This happened 2 more times before Grey finally decided not to go. Given that Ngāti Maniapoto further south was still wanting to fight, it was probably the only decision that he could have made. Grey had arranged for Imperial Army reinforcements and had just signed into law the New Zealand Settlements Act, which would provide legislative sanction for sweeping land confiscation. So Cameron continued marching his troops up the Waipa Valley towards the rich agricultural lands of Rangiofia and Te Awamutu. Cameron's troops reached the fortified pa at Patarangi in early February. He realised that he couldn't take the pa without risking heavy casualties, so he bypassed it during darkness and continued on to Rangiofia, an undefended village that had been set up as a place of refuge for women, children and the elderly. Cameron had been advised of this by Bishop Selwyn, who was travelling with the troops. On the 21st of February 1864, Cameron's troops attacked the village at dawn on Sunday morning. The British recorded killing around 12 Maori. Maori claim over 100 were killed, including women and children. 7 people were burned to death inside a whare. From a military perspective, Cameron's actions were successful. When the Māori at Taranaki heard of the attack, they rushed out to protect their women and children, leaving them vulnerable to the British forces, who were then able to occupy the deserted Taranaki part. However, it was a turning point for Māori confidence and respect for the British government. Use of such tactics against women and children was against everything that they had been taught by the missionaries. 2 days later, Cameron's troops attacked Rewi Maniapoto's own settlement at Kihikihi. The Waikato War finally came to an end at Ōrākau on the 2nd of April 1864. The pa at Ōrākau was not well positioned. It could be surrounded and had no secure water supply. It was occupied by around 300 Maori from many central North Island tribes. Women and children were also present, as Maori could no longer trust the British to respect them. Surrounded by around 1,400 British troops, the occupants of the pa ran out of food, water and ammunition. They were offered one last chance to surrender and responded with, "Eho, ka whawhai tonu mātou, ake, ake, ake." Friend, we will fight on forever, forever and forever. There was a small gap in the British force at the rear of the pa, and at mid-afternoon on the 2nd of April 1864, the pa's occupants began walking through that gap, spreading into smaller groups as they went. They were then pursued by the British troops, and over half were killed in the bloody rout that followed, including women and children. While Ōrākau signalled the end of the Waikato War, it was far from the decisive victory that Cameron was seeking. Rewi Maniapoto and many other Maori escaped, taking refuge beyond the Purniu River. This became the new boundary between the Crown-occupied land and Kingitanga, and soon to be called the King Country. Kingitanga had been defeated, but it was not destroyed. Grey then confiscated 1.2 million acres of Maori land, all the way from South Auckland to the Purniu River, just south of Te Awamutu and Kihikihi. Most of this was land owned by Ngāti Mahuta and Ngāti Hawa, who had been striving for a peaceful solution. Much of the Ngāti Maniapoto land was untouched. The once flourishing Maori economy in the Waikato had been destroyed, and the land was left desolate. The next 2 decades would see a standoff between Kingitanga and the Crown while Maori lobbied for the return of their land. Why did Grey choose war? What I've just described describes what happened. Now I want to look at why it happened. What advice did Grey receive? What options did he consider? I'll start with John Gorst, who arrived in 1860 to teach at a Maori mission school in the Waikato village of Hapu Hapu. He became good friends with Wiramu Tamahana during this time, and their friendship survived Gorst later being made a magistrate for the colonial government. Consequently, he was in a unique position to understand both sides of the conflict, and 4 years later he published The Māori King, or the story of our quarrel with the natives of New Zealand. In a letter to Sir George Grey in 1862, and recorded in the British parliamentary papers, Gorst outlines the real problems being faced, and I quote, "But there is a danger which is very much more serious and a permanent source of peril to the colony than that one symptom whereof is the Māori King. It is the utter lawlessness and anarchy of the native population in New Zealand. The greatest mischief of all is not that the natives choose to be governed by a king instead of by us, but that they are not in any real sense governed at all. As long as individual Māori can do what is right in their own eyes and break the laws of God and man with impunity, so long will peace and prosperity in New Zealand districts be an impossibility." The great remedy then for the evils of the land is government. But I mean vigorous government. I mean authority which is able to protect life and property by enforcing obedience to the law. We do not want additional laws. There is the very madness of lawmaking infesting the country. We do not want magistrates. They exist in abundance. It is the last link between the sovereign and the subject. It is the police which is defective. If there existed a power which could take up and punish offenders against the 6th and 8th of the 10 Commandments, the sores of the land would be healed. Who will dare to organise and use such power? The Runangas dare not. The Māori King dares not. The European magistrate dares not. The paid assessors and constables dare not. Is there anyone who dares? I know as well as anybody that this question is beset with difficulty and danger, but there can be no peace in the colony until it has been fairly met and fully resolved." End of quote. However, while George Grey was happy to forward this report to the Duke of Newcastle, he ignored its main conclusion. He was preparing for war and the confiscation of Maori land, and it was too late to change. Following Grey's invasion of the Waikato, Sir William Martin wrote a detailed report, which Grey also forwarded to the Duke of Newcastle in London. Sir William Martin was the first Chief Justice in New Zealand and was generally regarded as firm, impartial, and of unimpeachable integrity. Under the section on the principle of English colonisation, he wrote, and again I quote, "It is plain that the framers of the treaty desired to bring all the natives of the islands into the position of subjects of the Crown, but it is not to be conceived that they contemplated the introduction at once amongst all the New Zealanders of the minute and technical forms of English law. They regarded only the substance of the law, the substantial fruits of settled government, the legal protection for life, legal protection for property. This is a proposition which I think no Englishman will question. Such then was our understanding." End of quote. He then went on to say, "Many years must elapse before our colonisation could extend over the whole country." Martin then quotes the native minister, Francis Dillon Bell. Quote, "The grievance they complain of is that the more land they sell, the more they become impoverished. This arises simply and naturally from the one great mistake we have made in always trying to give them the least price they would accept for their land, in order that we might ourselves get the greatest price we could by its sale. If you had said at the commencement that the Crown would obtain the native land on a plan to secure the advancement of the race, you would have had no distrust or dissatisfaction in the native mind. You have at last brought the natives to believe that your real object is to impoverish and degrade them." End of quote. Then, quoting Crosby Ward, Sir William Martin adds, and I quote, "Promises of hospitals, schools, further payments out of the proceeds of land sales, and other advantages which have been made to the natives when they ceded their land were forgotten or disregarded." End of quote. Martin then quotes John Gorst saying, "The Māori King is kept up by the feeling of distrust and opposition to the English government, but it is the existence of this distrust, not its manifestation in the form of the Māori King, that is dangerous. To secure safety, we must cure the disease, not stop its symptoms." End of quote. On the confiscation of land following the Waikato War, Martin describes how the claim of the dispossessed owner is remembered from generation to generation, and how the brooding sense of wrong breaks out from time to time in fresh disturbance and crime. He then identified Rewi Maniapoto as the real source of the trouble when he refused to obey the Māori King and Tamahana's orders not to fight in Taranaki. Consequently, the rest of the Waikato should not have been invaded, nor had land confiscated. You can read the whole report in the British Parliamentary Papers, 1863. Finally, we must view William Fox's response to Sir William Martin's paper, as recorded in the British Parliamentary Papers, 1864. William Fox was the Colonial Secretary at the time, and I quote, "I have carefully read Sir William Martin's able and elaborate paper. His main aim appears to be to show that a general or even extensive confiscation of the lands of the natives who have engaged in rebellion would be beyond the power of the General Assembly and would be unjust and inexpedient. The problem to be solved by the government is not merely how to put down the existing rebellion. It is of no less consequence to prevent its recurrence. Experience has proved that mere military defeat has little more than a temporary effect on the Maori, and that as soon as he has had breathing time, he is ready to renew hostilities, by which he loses little or nothing, but gains much plunder, and inflicts ruinous loss on his ultimately victorious opponents. There are only two methods by which periodical outbreaks can be prevented. One, the continued maintenance of a large military and naval force, such as at present is provided by the imperial and colonial governments, and which converts the colony into a camp. The other, the introduction and settlement of so large a European population as may render insurrection hopeless in the eyes of the natives, and easily repressible should they be mad enough to attempt it. To secure this end, population must be introduced into those districts now sparsely inhabited by the rebels, and from which they make their inroads into the settled districts." End of quote. So instead of addressing the real issue of enforcing laws through the colony and providing what had been promised to Maori from the land sales, George Grey chose to follow Fox's recommendation, and he confiscated land across most of the Waikato before setting his sights on the Bay of Plenty. Outnumbering Maori with British settlers was his preferred solution. Did George Grey make the right choice? The money spent on the war, which was ultimately written off by the British government, could have been spent on addressing the problems outlined by John Gorst and Sir William Martin. But how do you restore trust when it has broken down so badly? Share your thoughts in the comments below. While we can't change what happened, we can certainly consider if there might have been a better way forward, as this may help inform how the problems that still exist today might best be resolved. The invasion of the Waikato and the Bay of Plenty was a disaster for all concerned, and it was just the beginning. Fighting would flare up again in the Taranaki before spreading to the East Cape and the Urawiras. I will cover this in my next podcast. Until then, I wish you the compliments of the season and encourage you to click through to kaimybooks.nz, where you can read many of the books and papers that I've referenced. Even better, purchase Moving Forward from Our Past or buy it for a friend. We've got an election coming, and while my book has no political affiliation, the facts presented may help inform whatever you decide.